probably the most important thing. We'll come back to that. But that website, olderadultnestegg.com, I think will be valuable to everybody here who's concerned about financial aspects of caregiving and financial exploitation. So we got to now talk about the wallet study, our new study. We're trying to do something that everybody thinks is a great idea. Nobody thinks it can be done. Vanessa and I are showing it can be done, and we can learn a lot from it. So I want to talk about that. So right into the, there's two types of intelligence to think about when you're talking about cognitive aging. So I want you to leave the world of Alzheimer's behind right now and enter the world of gerontologists. What happens to cognition as we age without disease? Okay, that's really the question. Does it change? And there's really two types of cognition that we need to think about: crystallized and fluid intelligence. So crystallized intelligence is what? It's all about facts and expertise. It's all about things that we learn throughout our life and accumulate. If you've been in a certain job or career for a certain number of years, you keep growing, you keep developing, you keep adding to your expertise. You don't subtract from it. It's something that actually increases throughout most of the adult lifespan. Might be just until the very late stages that it might kind of start to decline just a little bit. And I see we have some folks that look young enough to be students. Do we have some students here? Excellent. And if you think back to the beginning of the semester and then now, hopefully you've learned maybe 3 things, right? All right. Excellent. Excellent. You've learned 3 things, and those things will stay with you, and you'll keep building on those. So it's like a class, really. Think about that. You're building your expertise. And some of that's going to stick with you as you carry it forward. Now, fluid intelligence is what we think of when we think about cognitive aging. That's memory for new information, problem solving for new kinds of problems. So being put into a new situation and having to figure things out. Takes longer. We don't remember quite as much. Okay, that's what we think about when we think about cognitive aging. I'll show you a graph here. So this graph, the red is for longitudinal studies, the gray is for cross-sectional studies. And I always like to tell this story. Early in gerontology, what they did was they compared 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 60-year-olds, and 80-year-olds. And you peaked at 20, and it was straight downhill from there. That didn't make any sense. Sorry, no offense to our 20-year-old students there. That didn't make any sense at all. So, well, they started studying people over time. And what they discovered was some of that was just a cohort effect. Every generation had a little bit more education than the one before it. And so the differences were so much more pronounced. But once you control for education, you got more of a flat curve, and then you start to see a decline. Now that looks like a lot, the way the curves are, but actually that's a very modest decline, and usually not until the 8th decade. So not until people are in their latter 70s, early 80s that we get this more reliable decrement. However, most important to know about gerontology is individual differences. If you're like my friend Paula there, you know that you're right there on the top, Paula. Absolutely. That is, it doesn't change at all. This is true for about 15-20% of older adults in their 70s. Remember, normal aging. And we all know somebody 97, we say, oh my goodness, if I could have been as sharp as they are now, how great that would have been. And they exist. That's living proof. So we got to remember that. There's individual differences. We can't make assumptions. just because those graphs before all show a little sloping curve, that doesn't mean everybody's going to fit that curve. And that sloping curve is the middle group. About 2/3 of adults, these are people in their 70s, this graph. And this is actually a fluid intelligence testing, memory for new information. And so you can see, as it gets towards the later 70s or in their 80s, a little bit of decline. Everybody was in their 70s when they started. Some people were in their 80s when they finished this study. And then that bottom group is not an Alzheimer's group. That's just an anomaly. We have a lot of differences, about 10 to 15% of people, for whatever reason, in their 70s will see a much steeper drop in their memory function. Okay. So it's not as simple as everything goes downhill for everybody at the same pace. Not at all. And with crystallized intelligence, there's a lot of strengths. So let's tie it to money. Cognitive aging and the capacity to manage money. We saw that graph about cognitive decline. So what happens with the ability to manage money? Again, normal aging. Why do 95% of older adults manage debt, pay bills, maintain good credit just as well as 50-year-olds? And the answer, actually, is crystallized intelligence. If you've been paying your bills throughout your adult life, you've developed a lot of expertise. And so to continue to do that doesn't matter if you might have lost a little bit of memory. You have a lot of strength built up. Now, it's different, though, because in couples, a lot of time, one person pays the bill. I want you to think about your own situation. How many people here, this is the only one we'll have, that are in a couple, you both sit down with all the bills and you pay them together? Raise your hand. Okay. Couple. Excellent. But not many, right? Usually, we sort of divvy up tasks, and somebody says, hey, I'm better at paying the bills, I'll do this. So what happens then if that person develops Alzheimer's disease or they pass away? Then the older adult who has not been paying the bills, that actually now becomes a fluid intelligence test. This is very new. It might be sharp as a tack, but it's a new problem to tackle. And, my own family, my dad paid the bills. He developed dementia. My mom was sharp as a tack, but it really was intimidating. Got to get things ready for the accountant and got to pay these bills and know all the ones that have to be paid. And so it was definitely, I could see it was a fluid intelligence task for her. So that's what happens. So we have to, part of what I'm going to tell you today is that context matters a lot in all of how things finances. Well, there is a little bit scarier part to this financial story, and this data is at the 30,000-foot level. They're using the Health and Retirement Survey, the largest population-based survey of older adults in our nation. It's a fabulous survey. It comes out of the University of Michigan, but it samples the whole country, age 55 and over, every 2 years. And so they can see, hey, during this 2-year period, somebody has had a memory decline. And those people who had a 10% memory decline across a 2-year period experienced a 15 to 18% wealth loss during the same time period. Equally important is that most of them weren't diagnosed. Probably most of them didn't even, if you had asked them, probably would say, my memory is just as good as it used to be. Because early on in memory decline, it's not always that obvious to any of us that something's going on. That's the 30,000-foot level, and that scary part of the story is why we decided to jump in with our study, and I'll tell you about that later. We're going to go into financial exploitation because this becomes part of the story too. That vulnerability that can occur as our memory starts to decline, our problem-solving abilities perhaps aren't as good as they were. So these domains come from the work of Ken Conrad and Mickey Iris, real leaders in gerontology and in elder abuse. And what they did, I like how they set it up. It's from most severe to least. And so thefts and scams. When older adults, any of us, lose money to exploitation, someone either steals it from us or they deceive us into giving it to them. Okay? So that's how we lose the money. That's thefts and scams. That's where the money goes. But how does it get there? And these next three are really the mechanisms by which exploitation occurs. First, abuse of trust. This can occur in families. It can occur with professionals. So a few years ago, I testified in Washington, D.C. against a financial planner who had a client who was an older woman. Her only relative lived in Czechoslovakia, her sister. And so she moved out of an apartment where she had a lot of support into an assisted living. And unfortunately, I think he was running into some hard circumstances in his life, and maybe it was just too tempting. But he became her executor, and eventually he became the recipient of her estate. And of course, that's contrary to anything that a financial planner should be doing. Well, she did have a lot of friends in the old apartment. They were pretty sharp, and they leveled a complaint, so forth and so on. And so the trial that I was at was about whether he should practice anymore and whether he should be fined. He had abused that trust. Okay. She trusted him, and he had manipulated her, isolated her, let her think that other people were trying to take advantage of her. Her memory had started to slip. She wasn't reasoning as well as she had before. And so she trusted him, and he prepared all the documents to take to the attorney and so forth. So abuse of trust, this can happen even in a minor way in families. We get the report, Peter, I gave my daughter my debit card. I wasn't feeling too well. I told her, hey, go ahead and take $200 for yourself and bring me $300. And she took $2,000, and she still hasn't apologized for it. So that's abuse of trust also. Okay. Financial entitlement. So financial entitlement is really mostly about adult children or other relatives who start to see their parents, older parents' money as their own inheritance. And so if it's my inheritance, why can't I use it now, Peter? Now you and I, we call that stealing, but they don't. They honestly don't. They honestly think, well, I've started taking you to the doctor. I've started picking up a few groceries. As a matter of fact, since I'm taking you to the doctor, maybe we should ride in a nice Mercedes or Range Rover or something like that. And every 6 months I'll take you somewhere. I'll use it the rest of the time. And that's the way the thinking is about financial entitlement. This is my money. And they don't understand the boundaries of finances between the generations. Now, one of the impacts of financial entitlement is it really puts a cloak of secrecy on communication about money across generations. And so people aren't talking to each other about, as someone gets older, how are you going to protect your finances? Because it's become a taboo topic, right? Now I'm going to look at my young friends here, younger friends, and how many of you know even where your parents keep their accounts and all their financial records? Raise your hands if you do. Yeah, okay, maybe about a quarter. And that's about what the statistics show. That about 3/4, it's like, hey, I start treading on that, that's going to throw the family dynamics out, and I may not get invited to Thanksgiving dinner. So I'm not asking. But we'll talk about why this becomes important and how people can talk about it and what they can use. Coercion is essentially undue influence, and that's pretty extreme. But that's sort of what this financial planner did. Isolation, poisoning of relationships with others. We tend to think of memory loss and dementia, we tend to think of it just as a cognitive part. And we don't often think that there's other parts to it. There's always three parts: the psychiatric and psychological part, and paranoia is one big part of that. And if you're good at it, it's easy to make somebody with memory loss become a little bit paranoid. Who do they become paranoid about? The person that's taking care of them most. The caregiver, the principal caregiver. And then third is function, and money is part of function. Money, driving, medications, those functional things are all impacted as well. Now the last two are kind of risk factors. Are you handing out your bank account information over the phone to people? Are you giving away other personal information? Are you giving your son, your daughter, your credit card and debit card? Are you having them sign checks for you, etc.? And that last one, money management difficulties, sort of goes hand in hand with wealth loss. If you're losing that ability to manage money accurately, you may not be aware that you're actually losing wealth. How much financial exploitation is there? So they've done some population-based studies in the last decade. This is the one most cited, Ron Asiarno. About one per year, about 5% of the population over 60 is reporting they've been financially exploited. Now that's a way underestimate, we know. So we don't really know the actual figure, but we do know that it's the second most common form of elder abuse. Second only to psychological abuse. Way more financial exploitation than physical abuse. Way more than sexual abuse. So financial exploitation, and you can see in this study, which represents our population, over half was misappropriated by family. Okay, and 40% by strangers. And interesting, the correlates, they do a big study, they correlate what goes with it. Deficits in your basic activities of daily living, bathing, grooming, dressing, transferring, toileting. If you need any help in those areas, that was correlated with it. And also the non-use of social services, so that isolation factor, which we'll come back to as well. Interestingly, in some other studies, found very similar findings. If you weren't in a romantic relationship, if you were not partnered, you were more likely. If you're African American, you're more likely to report financial exploitation. Depression. So all of these things got us thinking quite a bit about, well, we're all vulnerable to fraud. All of us are. We all can be defrauded. People can go to great lengths to deceive us, and they can do a good job. But some people are probably more vulnerable than others. Now, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has a report that banks and money service businesses are required to um, contribute to, and this is suspicious activity reports. These are cases in which they're wondering, is there exploitation going on? Okay? And what we know is, as this issue has become more and more front and center, and it really has, we know that financial exploitation of older adults is called the crime of the 21st century for good reason. It's not only increasing, but we're also increasing the amount that professionals know about it. From 2013, when we had 1,300 cases a month reported to the CFPB, to 2017, 5,700 a month. So quadrupled. Some of that's real and some of that's just better awareness. Those equal, in real dollars, $1.7 billion. The estimates really are as high as $30 billion a year. And 80% of those losses came to an older adult. The average was 34,000, but 7% lost over 100,000. And a third of these folks were over the age of 80. The way it goes about was different. Now, these money service businesses, that's MoneyGram, Western Union, and I call them out for a specific reason. Both of them have been fined in the last decade by the Federal Trade Commission because they were educated not to wire money to all these scam places, and they had a few rogue operators who got a lot of kickback and indeed did wire, so they got hammered by the Federal Trade Commission. But nevertheless, when you go to money service businesses and you look at their SARs, their suspicious activity reports, almost all of them, 7 out of 10, were strangers to the older adult. Makes sense. I'm wiring money. I don't usually wire money to someone I know. I usually give them money or send them a check or something. And that's exactly what they found in the banks. If I went to the banks and had suspicious activity reports, chances were I knew the people. So where we see the exploitation impacts it. And look at this last one. Everybody know what a fiduciary is? A fiduciary is somebody who is legally responsible to act in whoever they're a fiduciary for the older person's best interest financially. Everything they do legally is to be in that person's best interest. Now, my guy who got, by the way, he did get his license revoked and he did get fined. Yes, score one for the good guys. It took almost 3 years for the administrative judge to write the opinion. I thought I'd never hear what happened to this guy, but thankfully he got nailed. But for good reason. The fiduciary average loss from a fiduciary was $83,000. Well, that makes sense. They have legal access to all this money, and so it's easy for them to get it. So it's really important, and I'll go into this later. If you're going to manage somebody else's money, to do it right, and that's what Nest Egg is all about now. So now, if you've heard all this before, just tell me, and we'll go through it quick. But I thought, as we transition into dementia, and I know that previous speakers probably have very similar slides, I just thought I would point out some highlights about Alzheimer's disease and where we are. So it was discovered in 1906, but the National Institute on Aging, which is the National Institutes of Health division most responsible for Alzheimer's research, was not created until 1975. And interestingly enough, that was because Alzheimer's was thought to be a rare disorder for middle-aged adults. We know that now that was early onset Alzheimer's that they were referring to. And they left out the other 98% of Alzheimer's victims, which are typically age-related. And because getting old, everybody's senile. That's really kind of what the thought was. And so it wasn't until they started doing some aging-related brain autopsy work they found that all these people who had memory loss and other problems of activities, daily living and function, had the same plaques and tangles as Alzheimer's original patient had. And then there was a movement, and we created the NIA. In 1984, the first Alzheimer's criteria for diagnosis were created. It's a clinical diagnosis, right? You can't diagnose Alzheimer's disease definitively unless you have brain tissue, although we're getting very close to being able to do it almost 100%. Without that, we have other biomarkers. And so 25 years later, with all the progress that was made, they formed these new work groups and kind of developed some new criteria. And there's Alzheimer's himself. Chance favors the prepared mind. It's an interesting story. He worked with Nissel and Kraepelin. Nissel created the brain staining technique right before he met his patient, August D. Otherwise, he would never have seen the plaques and tangles. And actually, his boss, Kraepelin, named it Alzheimer's disease 3 years later. When he was writing a text, he was trying to raise some money and visibility for his psychiatric institute. But it's funny how chance favors the prepared mind, right? And interesting about August D, she was in her 40s. She was quite psychotic, so she had strong psychiatric symptoms, very delusional, and very severe memory impairment. Okay, so she had the early onset. It was fairly advanced. And this cartoon shows the plaques outside of the brain cells, right? Amyloid plaques that have an abnormal protein that snips off. This goes through our bloodstream and builds up. And now some of the research really is trying to say and look at, for people who have a high genetic risk, can we detect plaques 20, 30 years before there's any symptoms? And that's some of what the Diane study is doing and other studies of early onset. And then, of course, tau, which is right inside the neuron, comes second. And these filaments, which are really used for the structure, tau itself, the structure of the neurons, when it has some abnormal breaking, impacts the brain cell itself. This is a little bit dated slide. You can see 2003, but I'm always surprised at how accurate it is. And what it is it's kind of looking at what are we going to see in terms of the number of people who have Alzheimer's by age group. And if you look at the 65 to 74 group, it's just pretty stable. And that tells us, if you look at the 85 group, wow, right? Fourfold increase by 2050. And it's really just about doubled, not quite, but just about doubled from where these guys were when they started in 2010. Or, excuse me, yeah, 2010 or 2000. So we see this with the boom of the aging population, with just the sheer numbers of people. There's a lot of evidence that the rate of Alzheimer's disease is declining. Okay, we've made so much progress with lifestyle and so forth. We see a little bit of decline, but the sheer numbers of people, and age-related, we're seeing many more millions that have Alzheimer's disease. What's the challenge then with people with Alzheimer's disease who are 85 and over? They've probably stopped driving. They're probably having other physical problems, some mobility problems, perhaps arthritis, other kinds of things. They can be quite isolated. And how we know they have Alzheimer's disease? And that becomes a problem. They actually their diagnosis is delayed compared to younger populations by probably about 18 months. And so it gets to be a challenge that way. And this shows that it's age-related as well. Minor and major neurocognitive impairment is what the DSM-5 calls it, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And not everybody with minor, or what we call cognitive impairment, no dementia, otherwise sometimes known as mild cognitive impairment, not everybody with that actually progresses on to have Alzheimer's disease. So, but that, nevertheless, having some significant memory problems and our Alzheimer's disease group, you can see with age. Biggest risk factor continues to be age. Gender, women have it kind of both sides of the coin. They get to live longer, by and large, but they often live with more health-related issues, all kinds of them, including Alzheimer's disease. Genetics, of course, there's a genetic predisposition for Alzheimer's disease. In early onset, it's very, very strong, kind of 50-50, but in later onset, it confers a risk that interacts with age. It could be 5 or 6 times the amount. Education. This is kind of interesting. This says basically that the complexity and the redundancy of our networks in our brain are better and more efficient the more educated that we are. And so when our brain is assaulted by something like Alzheimer's disease, we have more ways of adapting to it. And so we'll see the decline and we'll see the same trajectory, but when you start at a higher level and the decline is not as visible, you don't cross that imaginary line until later. And so it seems like it's pushing back the onset. It's called brain reserve, okay, cognitive reserve theory. Now, what I like to tell people, though, is because a lot of audiences feel like, hey, my husband, he had a Ph.D., he had an M.D., he was a brilliant lawyer, and he still got Alzheimer's disease. How could that be? And these risk factors are very modest and don't really apply to individual cases. They apply to sort of the population at large, okay? So absolutely, people with incredible education, brilliance, get Alzheimer's disease. We're learning that midlife conditions, chronic conditions, have a real strong impact on Alzheimer's disease in later life. Very important then to treat these, because that will help. Hypertension, diabetes, high cholesterol, heart disease, those are the big ones, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular risk factors. Family history, we talked about head injury, it's a confusing one. We know that there's some risk, elevated risk for people who have had head injuries. Again, it's very modest. We don't really know what the mechanisms are. Okay. So these new guidelines try to do two things. They try to say, look, let's look at Alzheimer's from a biologic perspective and incorporate these biological markers into understanding the disease. So you could now have biological case of Alzheimer's disease, plaques and tangles, but no dementia. Okay? And that's was the kind of the preclinical phase. Pre-dementia phase, mild cognitive impairment, and then the diagnostic phase. And this is sort of the continuum. So you can see on the top is that normal aging. It looks very much like my curve for fluid intelligence there. And you can see that a little bit. But in the dotted line, we start to see a more significant drop, and that's where mild cognitive impairment comes in. And that goes into dementia. So let's look at mild cognitive impairment. Concern about cognition change. So one of the criteria is that the person themselves is concerned, hey, I think I'm not as sharp mentally as I was. I don't think I'm doing as well. Impairment in one or more cognitive domains, and it's done by very careful comparison of test scores to normative data. You know, what somebody with the same age and education would be scoring if they didn't have any cognitive problems. Because there's always a range, and so this has to be well below what we would consider the range for normal. And the preservation of independence in functional activities. This is an interesting one, and they kind of have to watch how they use the language here, because that would sort of be like, well, at first they'd say, well, it doesn't really impact your life. But since we've learned a lot about finances and mild cognitive impairment, we know if you scratch deep enough the surface, it does impact your life. But it can appear as if there's no impact on independence. And it does not yet have a dementia. It doesn't impact social or occupational function. Now, how do we test for this? So this is a test that I use a lot. I didn't put all the words here so that I wouldn't get in trouble. But just to give you an example, it's the Ray Auditory Verbal Learning Test. So we'd read those, and then we'd ask you, read 15 words, and ask you to tell them back to me as best that you can. And I'll read them again and do the same thing. And again, and a fourth time, and one more time. And then I'll read you a new list. And then you got to just tell me the new list, not the other list. And then I'll say, well, you know, now that you did that, tell me the first list again, as best you can. Then I'll go do some other things, and about 20 minutes later, I'll come back and say, you know those words I read to you? Tell them back to me as best you can. So why do we do this? Why do we torture people like this? I mean, why do we test people like this? It's actually very important. When you're given the 3-word test, like on the mental status exam or whatever, that's really tapping into your working memory. It's not tapping into your learning and memory and your consolidation. But this is. I guarantee you, very few people, I haven't run across them yet, can give me all 15 after one trial. Yeah. Big surprise, right? So we're watching the learning and memory grow over trials, and we're seeing how they do that, and there's a pattern that we can see. Actually, with people with Alzheimer's disease, what we'll see is they'll remember the very bottom of the list and nothing from the middle or the top. People who don't have memory problems will remember at first a few from the top and a few from the bottom. It's called a primacy and a recency effect. You remember what you heard first, olderadultnestegg.com, and what you'll hear last. And I won't tell you that yet. Better than what's in the middle. That's why we put all this stuff in the middle. So that's why it's so important to do that. And it's really important actually to test people's ability to learn beyond what they would be able to grasp. Okay, the old telephone number, 7 digits, 5 plus or minus 2 is kind of what we would expect to see in working memory. We can get 5 plus or minus 2 bits of information in and keep it short term. But if we have 15, we got to use strategies in order to learn. So what can we have? There's just no good transfer from short term to long term storage. So we can see this lack of retrieval, this lack of memory and getting consolidated. We don't see improvements over trials. Like I said, I'll remember a few from the bottom of the list, maybe get one in the middle at the end, but not really add to it. and a recency effect. Now, there can be mild cognitive impairments with Alzheimer's disease unlikely. So we get this diagnosis of MCI, and yet we do our spinal tap or PET scans, and we don't see those plaques or tangles or that buildup of beta amyloid or tau. And that can happen. And it can be, like I said, for lots of reasons, vascular reasons, others. Could be intermediate, maybe there's just one biomarker that's positive, or it could be very likely. And with a very likely, we see a much higher rate of conversion from mild cognitive impairment to Alzheimer's disease over a 5 to 7 year period. So it's a two-step process still clinically, because we always have to differentiate between dementia and Alzheimer's. Dementia is a syndrome, okay? It's a constellation of symptoms, okay? Constellation of symptoms. Cognitive, neuropsychiatric symptoms that represent a decline from previous functioning, interfere with the ability to function in all your usual activities. It's not due to a delirium, an acute confusional state, not due to that new medication that you took or the infections that you got or the fact that you got extremely dehydrated, those kinds of things. It's more long-standing. It's not due to an active bipolar disorder or other major psychiatric disorder that impacts cognition. And it has to be assessed through both history and objective testing, and has to include at least 2 areas: memory, reasoning, visual, spatial, language, personality change, in order to qualify. That's dementia. Now, I'm glad that we have a younger generation in here, because let me direct this next question to them. What is the most common cause of dementia in people your age? For our younger classmates here. What's the most common cause of dementia? I'm sorry? Yeah, there you go. A+, TBI. Traumatic brain injury, right? It's not going to be degenerative. Something has to happen, some kind of trauma. And that's what happens for the most part. And that is the most common, due to motor vehicle accidents or violence, okay? For football players, of course, in the NFL, it's CTE, right? They're getting CTE, they're not chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And for older adults, the most common cause of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. And that's the first part of the definition. It meets the criteria for dementia. But the second one stands out to me. It's an insidious onset or invisible. I want you to think about someone in your life who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Think about the date they were diagnosed and look backwards. This is a Mary Sano's technique from Columbia, so I won't take credit for it. But it's a wonderful technique. Look back. When was the first time you noticed something that wasn't quite right? Okay. Mom got lost on the way to Thanksgiving, and we wondered how could she get lost, and she just, I wasn't paying attention. Everybody said, okay. And we think back, and usually we'll see that, yeah, the dementia probably began a couple years before the diagnosis when we look back that way. And that invisible period is a period of great vulnerability, especially when it comes to the pocketbook. Alzheimer's disease is progressive, so there is a clear-cut worsening. But like all diseases, it progresses at different rates for different people. If you're 85 and get Alzheimer's disease, one of the blessings, same with cancer, same with most diseases. It's much slower in its progression. And it's just part of the aging process. Everything slows down, including the disease. So you might not see as much dramatic change as you do in a younger And it can have a variety of presentations. And, you know, we really, I'm amazed when I listen in on the brain examination, postmortems that they do, the case conferences at the U of M, how many times the presenting symptoms seem like something else other than what the biology tells us the underlying disease is. And so we can't really always tell by clinical presentation what the underlying pathology is. So it's a little plug for the brain donation program. It really is so critical. Okay, I'm going to skip. I'm going to tie this back in now with financial exploitation. We're starting to see this, and this is a classic awful case. This is what the prosecutors see, okay? Because it's usually hybrid exploitation. In other words, more than one form. But in this case, it was pretty much pure financial exploitation, maybe a little bit of neglect. George was married. His wife had Alzheimer's disease, but he had it worse. He had it worse. How do I know that? I read the medical records, and they said, don't tell George anything. He won't remember a thing. If you have to impart information, tell his wife. She was a patient at the same place. She dies before George. So Leo, one of George's two sons, is kind enough to move out of his trailer and come live with George. Next thing we know, Leo has blown $425,000. And honestly, I got to see everything that he spent his money on. I think most of it was Taco Bell. You know? How much Taco Bell can somebody eat? It was amazing. Parenthetically, Leo lost another $250,000. He got scammed. Of course, all this is George's money. Okay. Leo finds a couple of upright, stand-up professionals, an attorney, and a financial planner to come say that George had the capacity to assign property to Leo, quitclaim deeds. Now, the problem is, of course, George can't even communicate, and so he doesn't, so Leo signed the forms himself. Leo was not your sharpest criminal here. So he signed the forms in his own name. He didn't even sign his dad's name. And so, of course, when this all comes out, the judge calls the prosecutor. They do prosecute Leo, thankfully, and his brother gets all the remaining property, but not before tremendous harm to the state. So we're seeing that theft right out of somebody who has pretty significant Alzheimer's disease. Well, if you're going to manage your money, what do you have to be able to do? You have to be able to count change still. You have to be able to manage a checkbook or money orders. You need to be able to look at your bank statement and make sure that it comes out okay. You need to pay bills, know how to do that, and do it on time. And this is too hard to see, but basically it says, people with mild or moderate Alzheimer's disease have a lot of trouble doing any of these things. There's a lot of variability in mild. You can see people still count change pretty well, and but only a quarter of people with mild Alzheimer's disease can do their bank statements. Well, with this exploitation going along, and this idea that people are saying, well, George wanted to give me his properties because I was taking care of him. We had no way to measure this. And so we decided to create some new scales to try to measure these financial decisions and the quality of them in terms of whether they were informed decisions or not. Now, we all make informed decisions using the same principles. Every time we go to the doctor, we sign a consent form. Every time we participate in research, we we sign a consent form. And what does it say? It says that we know what we're doing. It says that we have a choice. These intellectual factors here. We're choosing to participate. We're choosing to make a contribution or gift. That the rationale for doing so is reasonable and it's not based on some psychotic delusion. That we understand what it is that we're participating in, what it is that we're giving, and that we appreciate the potential risks or consequences to others and ourselves. But when we created this scale, we also realized that crystallized factors are really important for financial decision making. Context matters. People who are really experienced in finances, carry a lot more confidence with them, even when their memory is starting to get impacted. Maybe have more resources, and so don't have the financial strain. People who aren't financially helping someone else on a regular basis may not have the financial worry about day-to-day management. So that was what we called financial awareness. Psychological vulnerability, anxiety about finances, depression, the idea of not being treated with as much courtesy and respect as other people, that status and invisibility factor, loneliness around finances. That's what we call psychological vulnerability. And then susceptibility. How much relationship strain do we have in our life over money as we've gotten older? How much conflict with others about the way we spend money? And what we're measuring is the integrity of the financial decision making. And we use person-centered principles, and particularly Ben Mass' whole person dementia assessment. Context matters, the voice of the older adult is critical, and that we're going to analyze real life decisions, not the kind of tests that take us like I showed you about bank statements and so forth that are artificial. What does it mean? Context matters. These are brand new data. You're one of the first people to see them. How this happened? We put into the Health and Retirement Study a proposal to have about 6 or 8 of our questions included in their sample. And they do this. They open up competition. They selected ours. So in 2018, sure enough, they rolled them out. And they just released the early release data. And so, of course, we want to see what's going on. And it really surprised me. 2/3 of people are anxious about their financial decisions, at least sometimes. Over half wish they had someone to talk to about finances. Remember, we talked about the secrecy of finances, the tabooness. As people get older and they start getting confronted with things that really are novel problems to solve financially, they really do want someone to talk to. And if they're not talking with their children and they're not talking with their peers because it's taboo, why, they're going to talk to the scammer, because the scammer knows how to find them, and the scammer is a good listener and knows how to target them. And that is what that question tells me. Okay, no big surprise that people respond to these things. People are aching to talk about it. About 1/3 were worried that someone's going to take away their financial freedom. Wow, that's shocking. I didn't want them to choose that question. I told them, you're not going to get anybody to admit to that, but 1/3 did. 1/4 were not sure, confident in making a decision. Almost 1/3 said that at least sometimes during their financial transactions, they're treated with less courtesy and respect than other people. That's our ageism question. You become invisible. Becoming invisible has a powerful impact. And you can see some of the rest of our items. these were determined through our confirmatory factor analysis. How satisfied are you with your finances? How confident? How often you worry about financial decisions? Anxiety, depression, and here's a relationship questions. So we took these scales and we collected data on several different community samples. And this was collected by my research team and me. And we used the expertise of a national psychometrist so that she'd be unbiased and would see what the data said. We looked at reliability, we looked at validity, we looked at whether it was related to cognitive decline and to financial exploitation. And what we found is there's this real intersection. Cognitive decline, decline in financial decision making is where we see the most financial exploitation. And we don't always see early cognitive decline and decision making both deteriorate, but when we do, the rate of financial exploitation was incredibly high. And there are some of our publications. Anybody who wants a set of these slides, Aaron is more than happy to share them. Now, I want to talk to our caregivers about what we've learned in our studies on exploitation and decision making is that there's almost no place for caregivers to go to learn about how to manage somebody else's money, how to detect whether scams or fraud are occurring in their loved ones' bank accounts. And so we've created a new family and friends landing page on our older adult nest egg. Okay? This is our home page. Click on family and friends, and this is what you see. And then we've created several videos. We have 3 currently. The 4th one should be up any day now, but it wasn't up today. And what are they? One is detecting early cognitive impairment. As I said, that early period is vulnerable. So we want to make sure that we give people as many tips as possible on how to detect it. Another is managing someone else's money. And a third is detecting their financial mismanagement. The 4th, which should be up any day, is how to have these difficult conversations, because it's not an easy topic. And the mistake that many caregivers make is they kind of see the danger and they rush in and tell their loved one, you need to do this. You need to what? Stop driving, you need to move, you need to give me your checkbook. Those are probably the 3 things that people rush in and say have to happen. Okay, one of those 3. They get the door slammed in their face, the older adult changes the locks and cuts them out of the will, and that's very damaging. It has to be done very carefully, very gently. It's a collaborative exercise. One of the things that we're working on is how do we adapt motivational interviewing to have these kinds of conversations. It's actually come along pretty well. I'm the motivational interviewer. I take all this training and I tape, and my supervisor gives me lots of notes on things I'm doing wrong. And I'm like, wow, good point. Here I thought I did a great job, but 10 things I got to improve on. So we'll have that up very soon. And then we'll have a scale, our family and friends questionnaire, in which people can see how concerned they are about their loved one's financial decision making relative to kind of some research. And I want to tell you about our wallet study, wealth accumulation and loss in later life, early cognitive transitions. Okay? If you have mild cognitive impairment, or you perceive you have a decline in memory compared to last year, you say, my memory, my problem solving is worse than a year ago. We're interested in talking to you and having you be part of our study. What are we going to ask you to do? Well, we do the usual questionnaires, including some memory testing, but we'll do a bunch of those because multiple dimensions are affected when there's cognitive decline. But we also want to take a look and we'll do an analysis. We'll redact everything at your primary checking account, your records, and we'll share with you what we find. Why? We are trying to create a new real-world financial mismanagement scale. And it looks nothing like bank statement this or can you count change and so forth. The kinds of things that we're finding are patterns. It's really interesting in terms of how people fail to adapt as certain fees increase or certain categories of expenditures. We are seeing how people are influenced by others and start paying for things for other people. It's not even outright exploitation, but it's sort of being convinced. As one woman told me, I guess I'm trying to buy love. And that was the saddest thing to hear, right? So we're learning also about how stable things are. Maybe the volatility will tell us something. So we're collecting all this information. We're learning a lot each and every time now. I guarantee you. So somebody asked me, how did you ever get this past the Institutional Review Board, the Human Subjects Committee? I said, okay, well, let's think about it this way. You're going to come, you're going to ask people to give their blood, their genetics, right? All this very personal information, and you don't think anything of it. But if I ask for financial records, it's like I'm asking for the keys to the castle. That's how taboo it is. That's all I said to him. It just shows to show you. These are records that are delivered through the email or the mail every day to people. It's everyday kind of records, and now they're sharing them. We take good precautions. We make them all anonymous. Nobody can tell whose they are. We don't have names on any of our forms. We just like consent form, we just have a number. And that really kind of proved my point. And what we're finding is that people who come and start to have some trouble, we're able to offer them our services, our SAFE program. It's patterned after a program in Rochester, New York, and it really helps them recover financial footing after being victims of scams or identity theft. But now we've done it so that we have a caregiver empowerment piece, and we'll help any caregiver with whatever financial coaching needs they have. We also do a lot of education around it, and Paula does a phenomenal job with universal dementia caregivers. It's amazing what she does. Yeah, exactly. Paula Duran, stand up for a minute, Paula. Everybody should know Paula Duran. She came to me about 6 years ago, came to my attention. She told me what she wanted to do. I was absolutely floored. She really brings a positive psychology to caregiving, and she put together a whole program that is absolutely stellar. A lot of it based on some of her own experiences and insights. And so, thank you, Paula. And we'll enhance financial literacy for people, whether we're doing one-on-one coaching or helping them understand different situations. We'll work with credit agencies. We'll show them how to look at their own credit reports. We'll do all that kind of thing. Latoya Hall is our social worker who's really trained in financial coaching as well. And there's our caregiver empowerment program. So this is part of our SAFE program. Pat Mullins is back there. Want to give a wave, Pat? She has a lot of information about the SAFE program back there. And Vanessa is here, has a lot of information about the wallet study. Now I know I'm doing some personal advertising for us, but you can see we're here to kind of help people keep their financial footing. All right. Our caregiver empowerment program, you can see all the things that you need to know, proper record keeping. How many people knew that in the state of Michigan, if you're a power of attorney, financial power of attorney, and you have a joint bank account with your person that you're power of attorney over, that's illegal. Well, and the attorney general will come find you. Now it actually is illegal, has been since 2012 in the state of Michigan. So there's a lot to learn. It's important to keep records. It's important to be structured about it. There's a lot to do it. And how do you review? A lot of what we were learning, we did focus groups with caregivers. We said, how did you first learn about Alzheimer's disease in your older loved one? And about 1/4 said because they were being scammed, because of the mail that they couldn't stop answering, the phone they couldn't stop answering, or they forgot to pay their bills. That was the first sign of it. And we know that it had been going on for a little while. So thank you. If there are any questions or comments, I'm happy to answer them. Sorry if I went on too long there.